Looking around the room, these are a lot of people that we've seen at these sessions, so this is like having lunch with a big family of friends. So many of you have been involved in making the films and doing the great work, particularly on the culture track as it exists here at Skoll World Forum. So I'm Karen Murtis. I run the Just Films program at the Ford Foundation, and some of you may know me in my former life at Sundance, and a lot of the Sundance team is here. It's really fabulous to see everybody here. And this particular panel is, this is the 7th or 8th year that we've been here, and the great mastermind of this particular track is Sandy Hertz, and she has really developed over the course of the years this ongoing conversation about cultural intervention, specifically storytelling and transformation. And so this panel really resides, if you're going to search on the website, in line with all of those panels. And I've heard a lot of you were just at the Imagination, Jeff Search's Imagination panel with a lot of the filmmakers that are here. So it's been a great morning for all of you, and I'm actually still buzzing from the Paradigm Shift panel that a number of people were on. And if you haven't checked out the social index, the social progress index, you must do it. It's really a fabulous thing, and that was the subject of the last panel that we were at. So I'm just going to do a brief introduction because the people that you're going to hear from, the 3 people that you're all here to hear from, are really quite brilliant. We chose them specifically because we wanted to talk about the question of cultural intervention from the perspective of different genres. And so I'm just going to take you through a little bit of the thinking behind how we organized the panel. And then they're all going to present. We'll harvest a few comments and reflections as we move through, and then we'll all come up on stage and really engage in a conversation with those of you who are here. So I was very pleased to hear yesterday and today a little bit people talking about systems thinking and systems change. And this is something that at the Ford Foundation we're actually taking quite seriously. So I wanted to show you this systems thinking inspired bridge to social justice that the new foundation, and Darren Walker, you'll see he's here and he's going to be doing the closing plenary, that we're engaging in now. And so this is Donella Meadows' Systems Thinking Primer, and if you Google her, you'll find actually quite a wonderful book that she's written about systems thinking, and we've adapted that. And so what we're engaged in is thinking about change on 4 dimensions: changing the rules of the game, systems, changing power dynamics, and changing paradigms or beliefs. And so everything that we're doing at the foundation now is actually geared toward these 4 dimensions, with the theory being that any initiative that you want to undertake is going to get you closer to crossing the bridge towards a vision of social justice. So I wanted to bring out that resource for you, and I'm going to go back now because these are the folks that you're going to hear from, and I wanted to put their URLs up there for you so that you can Google madly while we're all talking. So keep your computers open, keep your phones open, keep your phones off. I'll do the moderator's notes now. Keep them silent, not off, but silent. Remember to do your tweeting, use the hashtag, check in if you have the app so that people at the World Forum know that you've actually attended something, so that we can track whether or not these sessions are actually what we think they are in terms of popularity, in terms of your responses. And I think you are being filmed. And I think that's all that I have to take you through in terms of the logistics. So the place that we want to take you is to think about how these different genres of storytelling are being used in terms of this transformational change. And we want to think about 3 areas. One is why in this sector as storytellers we actually don't often plan for success. We're so often so busy thinking about the challenges that are in front of us that when we actually manage to overcome those challenges and see some kind of success, we're actually sometimes overwhelmed and quite unprepared for that success. And so each of the stories that you'll hear actually has a moment of overcoming, meeting success, being overwhelmed by the success at a certain level, and then having to actually regroup. So we also want to think about the context of the work, the context in which the work, the storytelling that we're doing actually happens. Because, you know, if you think about it like, you know, your story is an arrow or a dart at a dartboard, and you're aiming to hit a certain spot when you're starting out, it's not as if you miss the dartboard. It's as if the dartboard entirely moves somewhere else in the process of building your story. So you're constantly in this with culture work especially, in this unpredictable, rather chaotic environment, and you're taking a lot of people with you as you're really trying to keep lined up on a moving dartboard. And so that's something that we want to talk about. We want to talk about the choice of genre. We chose for our panelists, filmmakers, writers, and journalists. And so all three of these are different examples of different kinds of interventions. And we also want to think about the timeline for change that people are really targeting. So there's short-term interventions, but we also want to think about feedback loops on the long arc of change. And by that I mean generational change. And the fact that the content that you're developing actually exists in both realms. So one is more immediate in terms of what you might want to get done in the near term, but then the harder thing to think about is how does it exist in a long arc of social change. And the final thing that I want to introduce is the notion that these folks are actually thinking about their narrative and their engagement in a kind of cyclical, simultaneous integration of engagement and narrative building. And so that's the thesis I want to propose to you, that actually what we're all about now, increasingly in our field, is the simultaneous, cyclical, engagement narrative building kind of circle. So you can think about it as a very dynamic process, and each of the three examples here, we'll talk about how they've been able to do that. And the final thing that I want to bring out, because this is a conference about belief, is the question of beliefs. And I want to take a quick poll in the room. How many people in the room would you say, just quickly, this is a broad stroke, non-scientific poll, how many people in the room would say that you believe that the world is essentially fair and just, that people really get what they deserve for the most part? How many people actually believe that? Nobody in this room actually thinks that the world is fair and just. That actually is not unexpected. In a room full of social entrepreneurs, you have a rather, what's called a just world bias. You probably have a weak just world bias. There are many people in the world that have a very strong just world bias, and that is their belief system. And when we're telling stories, we are appealing to the values and beliefs that lie underneath the actions. And there's been a lot of talk about how we understand behaviors in relation to our values and beliefs. And so the experimentation that was done over the course of several decades, but starting in the 60s in my hometown, Lawrence, Kansas, actually, at the University of Kansas, was done by a scientist named Melvin Lerner. And what he wanted to understand is why people actually, responded the way they did to perceived injustice. So he did an experiment where people actually viewed a subject being shocked when she wasn't able to perform whatever duties were assigned to her. And so in the one case, they actually viewed this, and they were given the choice of stopping the shock, stopping the torture. And of course, everybody was quite sympathetic and really wanted to stop it at all costs when they could, and that's what they did, that's what they chose. But when they were actually faced with the possibility that they could do nothing about what was happening to this woman on the other side of the screen, they were actually helpless in the face of this. He found it quite astonishing that they actually started blaming her for her situation. So in the absence of efficacy in that situation, when they couldn't do anything about it, which is something quite interesting for all of us to think about, because we're in the work of trying to make change, and when we find ourselves powerless. But when these people found themselves powerless in the face of the injustice, they started blaming her for her situation, somewhat unconsciously, but then as a group, they actually blamed the victim. And so we see this idea of the just world bias playing out in this very, very unexpected way. And we need to think about, as we're building our narratives, what are the unconscious frameworks that we're appealing to that sometimes have these unexpected consequences. So whereas you think you're actually building empathy, what you might actually be doing is building up resistance because you're going against very, very entrenched and often unconscious beliefs. So the idea that the world is a fair place is actually, you might believe it even more than you think you do, because what it's really about is believing that the world is orderly in some way and that you actually have some kind of control over the events in your life. And a lot of us do believe that. So we want to explore this very kind of profound, I think, contradiction at the level of beliefs. So what I want to take you to right now is, as we move forward, I want to introduce David. Bornstein, who is really quite brilliant. He's a legend in his own time. And he's a great friend to social entrepreneurs. He's actually written 3 books about social entrepreneurship. So if you haven't read them, you must do. But he has a new project right now that I want to bring him up and have him take us through about 10 or 12 minutes of presentation about his thinking about journalism and how it works in the world today. So David.
So this work, this is what I do on the CEO of the Solutions Journalism Network. I also write a column at the New York Times called Fixes, which we've been doing for 5 years, which looks at solutions to social problems in a rigorous way, in a non-fluffy, non-advocacy way. And this work really grew out of many years looking at social entrepreneurship, the field, coming to the Skoll World Forum, and really coming back home and telling my dad about this, and he would be watching CNN and be convinced that there's really no responses to the problems in the world. It's just people causing problems. And so I got into journalism. I was actually a computer programmer many years ago. I wanted to become a constitutional lawyer. It was really from a social justice perspective that I got into it. And for most of my career, I was sort of thinking that my job was in the business of mobilizing awareness, or in some cases outrage around problems, which is a traditional journalist's role. You make people aware, you're a watchdog, and so forth. But I had this experience. I met Jane Jacobs, and she became a mentor to me. Jane Jacobs, how many of you know who Jane Jacobs is? Put up your hand. So she wrote probably the most influential book on urban planning of the 20th century. It's called The Death and Life of Great American Cities. Wonderful book. And not only did she help save New York City in many ways, but she really showed people in that book how people really use cities. And it's one of the reasons why America moved away from large housing projects. And the idea that people use things in ways that are very unexpected. And we have these theories, but then when you go out there, it's not really how things work. And she got me thinking early on when I wrote a book how people are going to use the information in the book. How do people really use information? What happens to it? And so we would have these conversations when I would visit her in Toronto about how do people make meaning? How does information land on people? How do people use information? And I read her book, this book called Systems of Survival that she wrote, where she had looked at human history and found that there's 2 ways that human beings essentially guarantee their survival. They take things from other people by force, or they trade. So taking and trading were historically the way that human history evolved. And through those two types of survival mechanisms evolved very different moral codes. So here what this slide looks at is the moral code that's associated with the guardian system, which is essentially governments, samurai warriors, all the way up to modern militaries and so forth. And the one on the right is the commercial syndrome, which is a much more recent moral code. It's really only the last 300 or 400 years. The Guardian Code is much older. But the thing that's absolutely fascinating, when I read this book, it suddenly made sense why certain things, why when I interviewed somebody from the military, for example, or I interviewed somebody who worked in a prison, why they answered my questions a certain way. Because there's a whole series of values in there that are quite different from someone who, say, works in a company. So if you look at, for example, the idea of exerting prowess versus competing, those are very different things. If you look at the idea of the importance of discipline versus efficiency, hierarchies, loyalty, taking vengeance, and of course the most important one is honor and honesty, deception versus dissent, and things like that. You begin to understand why people working in institutions, and we do a documentary about why the military may have a difficult time acknowledging that there's a problem of sexual violence. Why is that so? And why do the people who speak to the press couch their answers in certain ways? Well, suddenly these moral syndromes really explain what the root of that behavior is. It's actually coming from a very old moral code that has been around for thousands of years. You find the same thing in business. And the thing what's so outrageous if you watch a film like Virunga, is the companies are behaving with a guardian value. They're powerful, they're not competing, they're using governments to ensure their access to doing something. So it's a real distortion, and it makes you angry particularly. It's also why businesses should never run prisons, and probably why governments should not get into things like agriculture and things like that. So, but it really makes sense of things. And so when I was reading that book, I began thinking of the ideas of how is it, as journalists, where communication is like a clinical intervention. Medical schools today, they are stopping, they're becoming less friendly to people who come out of their training with, or come into medical school with very, very high grades and perfect marks on their MCATs, but don't have social skills, don't have a lot of empathy, and show that. Because they're finding that the way you communicate in medicine is actually a clinical intervention. It determines whether or not people will actually understand what you're telling them, especially people who are in distress, and then actually act on that information in a way that is beneficial for them. So communication is itself part of the clinician's skill set. And you find the same thing in education today in schools. Advertisers have known this for a long time, that human beings are not rational and you have to understand how they're going to use information. But ironically, in the field of journalism and I guess in documentary films, although I think it's changing pretty quickly, we haven't taken account of the fact that when we communicate with people, there are real sort of externalities that we're creating in our communication in terms of what they're going to do with that. And so, for example, the Associated Press did a large survey of young people in 2008 where they basically said, what's the primary experience that young people have when they read the news or use the news? And it doesn't matter what platform it's on. It doesn't matter if it's on a phone or it's on a screen or it's on paper. The information, the primary response was helplessness, learned helplessness. And the primary impulse was to tune out. Okay? Now, we all are in this field of communicating to get people to feel powerful in some ways. This is a study that was done a couple of years ago that looked at the fact that our best efforts to communicate people about the severity of global warming are regularly backfiring. They cause people to reduce belief because exactly what Kara said, because it collides with the just world sensibility that they need to maintain. So they either have to change everything in their lives or they have to minimize, reduce, deny the message. And it's much easier to do the second. So people have done that. We don't want this to happen, right? We don't want the best journalism to backfire. So how can we deal with this thing? The other thing that we're finding, especially with global warming, but with a lot of other issues, is that denial is motivated. People are motivated to deny the problem, not because they really can't accept the facts. It's actually because they are stepping ahead to the message, and the message is, what are the implications of these facts if I accept them? What will I actually have to do if I acknowledge that this problem is real? And if what they think you're presenting they have to do is something that they're ideologically opposed to, or that really impedes with their sense of identity, they are very strongly motivated to not accept that message. So people are now calling this solution aversion. But the really interesting thing about most issues, which we've found in our work, is that there's often a very wide landscape of responses available for any problem, especially any widely shared problem. If you look at high school dropouts in the United States, there's 100 different ways people are responding to it, and some of them would fit in your ideology and some of it would fit in another person's ideology. You have the same thing with global warming. You have very pro-market approaches and you have very pro-big regulation approaches and lots of things in between. What doesn't come through for a lot of people is the awareness of the landscape of potential responses so that they can fit themselves into this problem in a way that accords with the person that they are. It's very hard to change people's characters and their ideologies and the conditioning that they've come up with for the last 30 years, but you can change the message quite easily to make that more acceptable. So in my own work, I run into this all the time because I'm always coming across issues that I think are profoundly important and incredibly depressing and difficult to deal with. So I wrote an article, I've written 6 articles about child trauma in the United States because the new research shows that child trauma is much more widespread than we understand. I mean, some of the statistics are really shocking in terms of the number and the proportion of children, especially in poor communities, who've had 3, 4, 5 serious adverse childhood experiences that really impact their sense of safety, their cognitive functioning. The problem has not even really surfaced in any national way. It's just beginning now. So when I wrote this this story. This was the illustration that the New York Times did with the story. So you can just see this is kind of where we're feeling emotionally the story is coming from. This was the story, you know, where they're describing it as toxic stress is the way it's been called. But the interesting thing is, when I wrote the story, this was the effect. It was the most emailed in the New York Times, and it was the most emailed on Facebook and all this. So how do you take a story about a really negative issue, a very difficult issue, and make it go viral? And this is what we've been trying to do with the Solutions Journalism Frame. And basically, the way we do it is we say, what is the efficacy around this story? The first question is, we have to make people aware or outraged about this problem, but if we begin with that, we may lose them very quickly. So where's the efficacy around this? And it turns out that there are some really brilliant interventions that are working very well with childhood trauma. Some Head Start programs in the United States have made real gains in terms of training the teachers to help the children learn to regulate their emotions so that they don't get kicked out of preschool. Because preschool expulsions are 3 to 13 times as common as K-12 expulsions. Imagine expelling a 3 or 4-year-old from preschool because they keep melting down and hitting their classmates over the head with fire trucks and things like that. So what do you do in this situation? What is a preschool instructor who herself is very likely to have also had adverse childhood experiences in the Head Start environment? The bus driver is also very likely to have had something like that. And the child's parents, if it's a poor community, is also very likely to have had these experiences. What do you do about a problem like this? Well, it turns out that there's actually stuff you can do. If you teach teachers how to attune to the children, you know, when the child is having a meltdown, don't give them a timeout. That's the worst thing you can do. Tell them, Jimmy, I can see how upset you are. Your fists are all balled up and your eyes are scrunched up. You must be really, really angry. Immediately the child relaxes because they feel that the adult is joining them. They're with an adult. And then you validate the child and you can say things like, I'd be really angry too if someone stole my block. That's a mean thing to do. And then you get into the whole problem solving. And this seems deceptively simple, but it actually works. Children will learn how to solve their problems at age 3 and 4, and they will say, the teacher will say, do you want to go to the calm down corner? Would you like to play with a Gumby doll? Would you like a crunchy snack? And the child will say, no, actually, I would like a glass of milk, and I want to sit in the beanbag chair. So, and then 5 minutes later, the child will come back and tug on the teacher's dress and say, I'd like to come sit back in the circle again. So here's a child at age 3 and 4 that's learned something that's profoundly important, and their trajectory has essentially gone from probably a very negative one that may end up in the justice system to one where this child has a chance to learn their ABCs, to be kindergarten ready, and to have friends. It's a huge difference. We can actually do this. There are people who are doing it. Not in every school, in a tiny proportion of schools, but we have, quote, technology. So that's the story. That's teaching children to calm themselves. And through this story, you learn about the millions of kids, and you learn about all the statistics and the national scope of the problem. But that on-ramp gives it the potential to go viral. So we've found that we can do this now. Our network, now we've worked with 40 news organizations around the United States. We're still focusing only on the US, trying to get this methodology into the sort of the DNA or the water supply of journalism, because journalists are quite resistant to change. They say that the news environments are the second most defensive environments today, second only to air traffic controllers. So getting change to happen is very hard in news. But you know, when people aren't making money and the customer's walking away from the product and half of this workforce is depressed or has lost their job, it's actually a good time for change. People are ready. So one of our partners, the Seattle Times, has been doing this regularly now for 2 years, and they've seen lots of things go up. The engagement has gone up. More people are reading the blog. They're seeing more impact out of their journalism. They're really excited to be doing journalism this way. So here's an example of a story that 2 years ago, this would have been an investigative story. And the story is basically about how low-income kids, mostly minority kids, are suspended and disciplined at alarming rates in public schools across the country. You know, there's 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds are being suspended for infractions regularly. The suspension rates are much, much higher based on the color of your skin. So you can go into that and say, this is terrible. We should do a watchdog story. We should call out some of these principals, some of these district superintendents or whoever, and hold them accountable. you could probably do that, and that would be an important thing. That story's actually been done many times, and it's been done enough that it's hard to get traction with that story. It's hard to get readership with it. So what they did is they found a number of schools that had had tremendous success switching to a restorative justice approach in their schools. And there's huge resistance in public schools to switching to restorative justice. It's essentially a non-punitive way of dealing with children when they're behaving badly. It's really ultimately very respectful about what's the skill that this child needs to acquire in order to be able to participate in the school community. It's very much about it's really corrections in the deep sense of the term. So this story that they wrote, A Disciplined Approach to Punishment at School, got great traction, and it led to another story that got terrific traction, looking at, here's the efficacy around this very serious problem. There are openings in all sorts of areas. This is a series that the Chicago Tribune did about gun violence in Chicago. Fantastic series. It had very, very powerful videos, very powerful photographic footage of the impact of gun violence in low-income communities in Chicago. When we were working with the Fayetteville Observer, or talking with them, they were going to do a very similar series looking at gun violence in Fayetteville, North Carolina. After some conversations, they ended up recasting this series through the question, how does a community build safety? Rather than, boy, do we have a lot of violence. The first series was, boy, do we have a lot of violence, and this is what it looks like, and this is how terrible it is, and we should all be outraged. And the second one is, what can we learn from communities around the United States who have had the same problem that we have had? And the problem, it's not minimizing a problem, and it's not, in some ways, it's making starker the problem, because when you have a sense of efficacy, it's illegitimate not to do something about a problem. It's very easy not to do something if you feel you have no options. So the Seeking Safety series that they did involved going to 12 cities for 1 year and looking at how they had gotten results against the same problem. So these are two stories that Greg Barnes, the reporter, did when he went to Memphis. And he found that Memphis had had a very, very good response with safety zones in reducing gang violence. And they had also had a very, very good response in reducing blight. Blight is a big indicator of the lack of public interest or the lack of public care for an area. And Memphis had found a way to increase by close to 400% its responses to blight from poor communities who often feel ignored by the powers that be. So that sense that the civic institutions don't matter for us leads people often to feel that, why should I participate in this society as a full participant? So over the course of the year, this not only led to really great looks at how organizations around the country or how other cities are responding to problems, but it led the city itself to come together, civic leaders, to form a committee to discuss what should we do and to try to raise money for a collective impact model around some of these very particular things. So it put tools on the table and it forced people to sort of confront the problem in a way that made it very, very difficult to walk away from. Because once again, it is illegitimate if there is something you can do. Now, there's not always solutions to every problem. So obviously, this doesn't work for everything. I was trying to think when I was watching Virunga, what can be done? How would I apply it to that? And I would love to engage you with that question, because I don't know the answer. That would be, but just to conclude, you know, in Jess's session that I just came from, I mean, the core message is that, one of the core messages was that this kind of collection of cottage industries of NGOs around the world seems to be disappointing a lot of people. It feels like, is it really making change? And how do we get back to the movements, to the idea that we need to change these things? We need to get movements to make people realize that there are serious crises and that empower people and excite people around their potential. And so I did a workshop, and Marshall Gans, one of the great community organizers in the United States, made this comment that it's a recognition of the world's problems combined with a recognition of the world's possibilities that brings change. And you have to have that in equal measure, you know, a sense of hope. And he defined hope in a very specific way. He used Maimonides' definition, which I'll end with, which is hope is a belief in the plausibility of the possible as opposed to the necessity of the probable. So hope is a belief in the plausibility of the possible as opposed to the necessity of the probable. And that really animates a lot of our work in helping people to understand and to see these plausible possibilities so that they can grow. They can get more water, more oxygen, more political funding, more more talent and support and resources from everybody in society. So thank you very much.
Jenny, are there any quick reflections or quick questions? Just a couple that we can gather. We're not going to answer them. I just want to gather some thoughts coming off of that. Yeah, Corey.
I mean, I love hearing that. It's like, so far, I've been taking so many notes. I just feel like I'm Corey Stern. I'm a filmmaker. I'm working on a film right now about the history of a really complicated issue, global public health, and how everything changed in the last essentially 30 years. And I'm just seeing so many parallels and so many things to include in the work and in the impact, related to the film, because it is so much about making people aware that this unsolvable problem is actually very solvable. And it's complicated, but just complicated doesn't mean impossible. And so this is great. So thank you.
That's great. Well, I think Jenny Bowen is going to raise the ante here from the plausibility of the possible to the implausibility of the impossible, because that's exactly what Jenny has been doing with her work in China. And this is, Mark Tauber is here from HarperCollins, and this is a book that was actually published out of one of the media partnerships, Wish You Were Happy Forever. And if you haven't read it, you should. One of the things that comes out of this book is actually wishing that you were a screenwriter again, because this is a really, really a wonderfully written book full of personal anecdotes about how you came to your journey. So if you could talk to us a little bit about Half the Sky and the amazing work that you've been doing in China. Jenny Bowen.
Hi, everybody. So as a former filmmaker, I always expect the unexpected and sort of have lived my life that way. I think diving into trying to help China reimagine and reinvent its entire child welfare system, since I wasn't particularly qualified, was evidence that I'm willing to take a leap. And I was busily doing that and thinking that the story that I was writing was going to be the story of what had happened for the children in China's welfare institutions. And then I was happily invited by Harper One and Skoll to write my story, and now I'm writing a whole different story. So you just keep going from one to another. I don't know where it's going, but I'm going to tell you kind of what happened and how that ended up, how I ended up here doing something completely unexpected. So 20 years ago, I was a filmmaker and a screenwriter living in Hollywood, had raised 2 children, was living a not particularly meaningful life, but living a life, and was very comfortable. And one day we saw an article in the New York Times about children who were basically dying, piling up in orphanages in China because they were little girls. My husband and I decided that we should try and save a life, because we knew there wasn't nobody to send money to that would make a difference. And so we brought home a child. Our little girl was like a poster child for everything that's wrong with institutionalizing children. Maya was almost 2 years old. She was, she couldn't walk, she had no language. She was emotionally just vacant, just a shell of a child. And I had just, the day after we wrapped principal photography on my last film, we got on a plane and went to China. So I had to edit a movie. I brought this little girl back. I didn't know what to do with her. She couldn't be held. She just was rigid. She was just blank. So I moved the editing room to my house, and I cut a movie with Maya on my lap as much as she would be on my lap, and I was in her face as much as she would allow it, telling her how much I loved her, that she was important, that her life mattered, holding her, playing with her. Her first words were dialogue from my movie. Nothing like sitting in an editing room to learn to talk. A year later, a year after the adoption, I looked out my kitchen window, and there out in the garden, through the glass, I was used to looking through rectangles, I saw that little girl and she was transformed. She was just romping around in the garden, playing with her friends, calling out, and looking like she was a child who had been adored from the moment she was born. And I just thought, oh, well, that's so easy. Why don't we just go to China and do that for all the kids we can't bring home? So that's what I did. So I went to China and somehow managed to convince the Chinese government to let me just try some programs in welfare institutions to bring family-like care to children in the institutions. And 17 years later, we have programs in 62 welfare institutions. We partner with the Chinese government. We are co-trained government, every child welfare worker in the country. And I kind of thought I knew where it was going. My goal was train everybody, create the model, show them how to roll it out, become just a training organization, and eventually put myself out of business. So that's where I was going. And I'm going to show you a clip from a CCTV documentary, China television documentary that just aired a couple of weeks ago. And you can see that this was also China's idea of what we were doing.
通过我们的努力呢，每个孩子都会有变化。就像我身边这个孩子啊，我觉得特别典型。刚开始的时候，有的医生说这个孩子是有点自闭症，就只是站在那儿，他都会害怕的发抖。然后如果你去碰他的话，他会大声的尖叫。然后你想不到他现在会是这样。Lovely.
I am working the hardest right now.
In 2010, at a ceremony in the Great Hall of the People, Half the Sky launched a Rainbow Program. This groundbreaking joint initiative with the Ministry of Civil Affairs aims at providing training for every child welfare worker in the country, and through this, establishing a national standard for childcare. Chunhui is holding its annual board meeting. The challenge they're facing is to carry forward the torch the foundation has lit and sustaining its work into the future.
春晖的资助过的福利院是37个，所以我们今天进到院里去培训，进行实操和理论的培训，就这个院里是很受欢迎的。我们请我的团队真的没有一个人是筹资出身的，所以我们真的是从零开始做起。
认真的这个做一点就是 fundraising 的这个 information package， 做这个呢，我觉得这是蛮重要的。
I sent a letter to my Half the Sky board of directors and I said, I'm sitting in this room at the Chunhui board meeting. I'm the only foreign face in the room. I'm not contributing anything to this meeting and I'm listening to 15 people figure out how to build the future of Chunhui for China's children. It's like a dream come true. It's not a foreign organization, it's China doing what I always dreamed that China would do.
This is historical.
It is. This is the best meeting I've ever been at. Because I did nothing. No! I did nothing. And it all happened. I mean, this was a beautiful meeting.
That's your goal.
Yes, yes, that's my goal.
This is your, from seed to fruit.
Today, a big tree with lots of fruit. So, for me, that defines success. I could see, I mean, we have lots of work left to do, doing exactly what we've been doing these past 17 years, but I can see the light. I can see where it's going. So, done, right? Mission accomplished. And then, I wrote this book. I learned while writing the book. You learn so much, of course, while you stand back from whatever it is you're doing in your life and reflect on it, which you must do when you're writing anything. I learned that what I was doing in China was addressing a universal need.
not just a need in welfare institutions, that children, young children, as much as they need food, and I've been saying these things all along, but now I really learned it. As much as they need food and shelter and medical care, children need the one thing that distinguishes us from all other creatures, and that's the need to be loved and to love others. The need to connect with other human beings, and the need to know that their lives are valued, that they have value, that they matter. And that's what allows children, any children, to reach their potential. The other thing I learned was that something I had been seeing all along with the children in our programs, but never really saw clearly, and that is that when young children, you can reach them early enough, while the brain is still forming, before the age of 7, before they're socialized to fail. If you can help them by giving them nurturing care, what we call responsive care in our programs, that other qualities, they develop other qualities that maybe the rest of us don't have such easy access to. And that's a kind of resilience and a kind of soulfulness and a depth of character and a kind of strength that what you watch these young children overcoming so much, having been abandoned, having been born with very severe disabilities, having been abused in terrible ways. You watch them as they're overcoming all of it and learning that their lives matter. And they touch something, we all draw from the same well, but they have easier access to it. And our children that we raise in privilege, I think in some ways we let them down there. They don't have that opportunity to touch the darkness in the well and to be able to come up with all those resources. And when I got out on the road with the book and I started talking to people about our work and how simple it is, really, it's such a simple idea what we do, but the great strength that we have is we've learned how to bring together communities, government, orphanage administrators, caregivers, and empower them, show them that they are the ones that make the difference, show them how easy it is to make the difference. And it's not just the changes in the children, but it's the changes in the communities, and how simple it is to do that in multiple situations. And if we can reach children early enough and really help them reach their potential, and that's their social potential, their deep down, those human resources potential, that they may be the ones who end up, fixing all these problems we've made in the world. And they are worth an investment. They are worth an investment because we don't even know what's possible. And nobody's really exploring it. So of course, when I was on book tour, everybody kept coming up to me and saying, well, you have to start these programs in my country. You have to start these programs over here. And as I came away thinking, gee, I know this thing and I know how to do it. And it's so simple. What we do is so simple. And we've done it in China, for God's sakes. We should just really, we really can't stop. Really, the journey is just beginning. And so I started thinking about where we began in China. And where we began was with a collision between a one-child policy, a well-meaning government policy, and a traditional preference for girls. For boys, yes. And how that collision caused this horrible abandonment and worse of little baby girls, and how we were able to go in and not fix the problem, but at getting so close to what resulted, we were able to change the system in China and change the way the government, the way the community started thinking about these children and started seeing potential in them. And it really has made a difference in the core problem. If I was going to take the work outside of China's welfare institutions, and prove that it's universal, I figured the first place to go was in China with another kind of situation that's a crisis situation, but that was not happening in welfare institutions. So in rural China today, there are 61 million children who don't live with their parents. They're left behind in rural villages while their parents go to the big cities and industrial areas to help China become a great worker nation, to build a great economy, to give us Westerners all those goods that we need. And there's a sacrifice. The sacrifice is China's future workforce. And so I started thinking about, well, I can't change that problem. It's inevitable that those parents are going to go away to work, that those children are going to be left behind, that 23 million of those children are under 7 years old and only see their parents once a year. Those are things I can't change. But maybe we could go in and get as close as we could to the root of the problem and start working in those rural villages and start talking to those factory owners and start finding some kind of synergy from that from the things that collided, came together. Out of that, bring something beautiful that maybe would have a solution for the children. So that's what we're doing. So we're starting in rural villages in China. We've got the government completely behind us. We're all levels, including state council, which is the highest level of the Chinese government. I mean, nobody wants this to be happening to the kids. The government is aware that it's happening. So they're working with us. We're starting a pilot project right now, this month in rural China. There's 340,000 of these villages with children filled with children who are left behind, almost all the children left behind. And we're starting in one county and starting a program that will pilot for 3 years and be evaluated by China Development Research Foundation and the Amsterdam Institute for International Development. And basically, we're hoping and we believe that it will become the model for China to roll out across the country. And we're also trying to work with factory workers, factory owners, and multinationals, manufacturers, to provide services for children at the workplace so that families will be more inclined to bring their children. And it's a little more complicated than I can explain now, but there's a give back portion where factory workers, we build them a beautiful children's center for their workers' children, and they pay double, and with the other money, we go back to the village and create something beautiful for the villages. And we're trying to rebuild these villages so that they are real homes for the children. So I'm just going to show you now my kind of film. Can I show 3 minutes?
Yeah, but I think we're going to have to show the film after. I don't know that we can show it now because of the time, because we had to start late.
Too much? Okay.
No, you didn't. But you can explain the film, and then we're going to.
So later on, you'll see. It's just a clip. This is dailies. This is not a film, but this is a clip from embedded in a village during the Chinese New Year, just after the parents have come home and gone, and you can see the problem at baseline. You can see where we're going. Sorry.
So I think just because we had to start late, and we definitely want Orlando to talk, what we'll do is Jenny has this wonderful clip of a film that she and her husband are making. And so the CCTV clip that you saw was actually government-controlled storytelling on CCTV. But Jenny and her husband have very, very unique access. In fact, it's quite unheard of to allow people to go into villages and film in the way that they have. And so that's a 3-minute clip at the tail end if people can stay after 1 o'clock. But now I want to introduce Orlando van Einsendal and the amazing film Virunga. How many people have seen the film Virunga in this audience, which is just a tribute to the incredible outreach effort. BritDoc Foundation is here, and they were very, very involved in the production and the outreach of this film. And Orlando is here to talk to you, not so much about the making of the film, but the impact after the film. So please welcome Orlando.
So I guess, you know, the theme of this is the unexpected. This has been a project which almost every part of it has been incredibly unexpected from, you know, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about the journey from a tent in the Congo through to an international campaign to try and protect this incredibly important part of our planet. So, but let's start with the trailer for the film.
Le parc national de Virunga, c'est la vie de la communauté.
C'est dans cette entité-là où vous pouvez encore trouver les gorilles des montagnes. C'est ça ma vie. Ils ont l'amour.
I think that we have a problem.
Companies are exploring for oil. I came here to cover the security situation.
I was sworn in to ensure that Virunga National Park's protected. Oil companies have a reputation for controversial ventures. All their efforts are focused on the national park.
In the past, it has brought a lot of violence here. Everyone wants their slice of the cake.
This isn't a war yet, but it could be soon.
Companies are playing with fire.
Fear has driven people out of these villages.
If we leave, we would lose everything.
The national park is the only hope this region has.
You must justify why you are on this earth.
Finalement, nous serons aussi jugés. Nous allons seulement croiser le bras quand le parc sera en train de disparaître.
Pourtant, notre souhait est que ce parc reste immortel.
So I guess, believe it or not, this film started as that was meant to be just purely a positive film. I, as a filmmaker, I mostly work in African countries, and I started off making these really kind of negative investigative films, but I kept meeting really inspiring people, and they were stories I'd never really read about back home. So I started to try and make positive films from the region. And one day I picked up a newspaper and there was a story about this place called the Virunga National Park and these incredible rangers trying to rebuild their country after 20 years of war and push forward these really ambitious development projects. So I went out to try and tell that positive story, and almost the day I arrived, the rangers and local civil society groups had actually, you know what the story is really about? It's about an oil company from your country that's illegally exploring for oil here. You know, and by doing that, threatening everything that this park was trying to do and create peace and jobs and stability. And so very early on, we realized that in our small capacity as filmmakers, we might be able to try and create a tool that could protect the park. Firstly, by documenting what this oil company was doing through investigations on the ground, but also by creating, I guess, a public awareness piece, you know, a film that could be shown around the world so that people would learn about what was happening in this region. Because up until we arrived, there was a lot of people locally who were investigating what this company was doing, but no one was hearing their voices. They were receiving death threats, and there was a sort of deafening silence. So we tried to make this film. I as a filmmaker knew that it needed to be as exciting as possible. It needed to reach a mainstream audience. I mean, I think you can be focusing on the most important social issue in the world, but if you make a film about it that's really sort of boring and dull, sadly it's not going to get the amount of eyes you want on it, and therefore it's not going to have impact on the social issue as much as you want it to. So we borrowed from films like documentary films that had had mainstream success about social issues, like films like The Cove or Dirty Wars. And we even looked to narrative films like Avatar, for instance, that touched on similar sort of issues, but did it in a really sort of mainstream way. Despite doing that, you know, I was just a film director. I didn't really have an enormous amount of knowledge. In fact, I had zero knowledge about how to use a film to actually create impact. And so we went to a fantastic organisation called the BrickDoc Foundation, who are experts in that, and they paired us up with an impact producer called Joanna Natasagara. And together we started to work from very early on with trying to create a strategy to use the film to have impacts, and that was about using targeted screenings and also a really thought out distribution strategy that would reach as many people as possible. So we finished the film and we were building up to its launch at the Tribeca Film Festival. It was pretty much today last year. And SOCO, this is the oil company, they were doing their utmost to try and stop this film ever seeing the light of day. They'd written to us and said, if you screen this film, you know, we may sue you. They'd written to all of the festivals that we were about to screen at and said, if you guys screen this film, we may sue you too. So it was this very sort of scary period. And then the day before the film screened, one of the main characters in the film, Emmanuel Demerode, who's the director of the Virunga National Park, that morning he'd taken the dossier of evidence that we'd all been gathering, civil society groups, the rangers, the filmmaking team, and presented it to the Congolese legal authorities. And on his way back to the park that afternoon, he was ambushed by several gunmen and shot through the stomach and the chest. Unknown gunmen, I should say. So we had this massive crisis about whether or not we should even go ahead. You know, what were we thinking about? You know, the worst nightmare that we could even imagine had happened. One of the people we were working with had been attacked, possibly because of their work on this film. But we managed to speak to him the day of the screening from his hospital bed, and he said, "No, please go. You know, the world needs to see this film. Go ahead." And so we screened the film that night. Because partly, I suppose, you know, that's the wrong way to say it. This a silver lining of what happened to Emmanuel was that it got a lot of attention, and there was that created a lot of noise, and we rolled out the campaign. I think, you know, we really had enormous ambition but very low expectation. I mean, we were going up against $1 billion oil company. We really didn't know what we could do with a film to try and stop them. So one of the first things we did, we tried to find the biggest distributor we could find who'd really get this to as many people as possible, and we signed with Netflix, who go out. Netflix goes out to 53 million homes in 50 countries. They showed the film to Leonardo DiCaprio, who came on board the film team, and you know, he brought an audience that otherwise might not be interested in film about Eastern Congo. We did an enormous amount of press. You know, we were fortunate enough to get nominated for an Oscar, which also helped create an enormous amount of media attention. And then we drove forward strategic screenings to the business community, to SOCO shareholders. They started to hold screenings on their own. We screened in Capitol Hill, in the UK Parliament, to the EU, to the World Bank. And you know, a lot of very sort of influential key influencers started coming to those screenings. We had the Clintons come to a screening just a couple of weeks ago. Desmond Tutu, Richard Branson, they started to come on board due to a lot of these targeted screenings. And then what was really fascinating was that a number of other independent organisations like Human Rights Watch, like Global Witness, the BBC, the Daily Telegraph, on the back of the film, they started to do their own investigative work, basing it on the allegations made in the film, but doing something independent, which was fantastic. So, what's been the impact? You know, there hasn't been this enormous moment where suddenly SOCO International just said, you know, it's all over, the park's safe forever. But there's been a lot of very positive incremental steps. the world's eye is on this park, which is, I'd like to think I'm someone who knows a bit about the world. I'd never even heard of this park before making this film, and I believe the film and the campaign around it has done a lot to raise the profile of Virunga. I think, people see the precedent of what would happen if a World Heritage Site like this was to fall. Where might be next? It's Africa's oldest national park. It's one of the most biodiverse spots on the planet. If someone like that falls, what is left? And the film's done a job of magnifying the voices of local people who are also, trying to shout loudly about the illegal oil exploration by SOCO International. I think the oil company, currently, they've halted their operations in the park, which is amazing. It's not quite as good as maybe it sounds, but it is a positive development. They've also recently just announced an independent investigation into the allegations, the human rights abuse allegations against them, we're very hopeful for what might that achieve. And the park's been given a breathing space to potentially fulfill its potential it's got this ambitious plan to create 100,000 jobs in the next 10 years. And what all the attention from this project has brought is space to do that before it is potentially destroyed by oil exploration from this company. So this is just this last clip is kind of, I guess, it's sort of some of the milestones of the last 12 months. And it's kind of just to show, I guess, with the right story and storytelling and the right sort of team built around it, you can, from small origins, do interesting, good things.
Called on Congolese authorities to investigate these acts of violence and intimidation and to ensure that both the park rangers and the activists can express their views freely without risking their lives.
heart-wrenching film. British oil company SOCO International.
The conflict is over oil.
Virunga in the Democratic Republic of the Congo.
You may not have heard of Virunga National Park.
A team of rangers.
Oil reserves making it a target for British oil company SOCO
International. That's having Austria support a Hollywood star Mark Ruffalo.
We're talking about, of course, is
wanting
oil.
to explore in Virunga.
Shot, ambushed in an assassination attempt.
What makes it so unique?
Corporations, government, everybody is trying to
talking about
conflict.
on time, and actually I'd like to invite you, the audience, to have the final word, if you would. We can go just about 2 or 3 minutes over, so we have about 5-6 minutes for people to offer some responses or thoughts. Given everything that you've just heard and what everybody's talked about, what are your reflections? I hate to go to Q&A because we'll get one question in, but I think it would be great for people to reflect a little bit on what you've seen and what you've heard here. Paco?
Yeah, hi. Thank you. I was just reflecting on Jenny's idea with the migrant workers, which is just starting, and migrant workers' children being left behind, and how that could apply so well to children being left behind in Central America by their parents who have to go to the U.S. to work. So it'd be really interesting to think about applying that model in Central America.
It's a great thought. Another comment? Takeaway, a leave behind.
I'm thinking so much about David's framing of your audience's moral orientation, and we get so frustrated with our audiences when we feel that we don't hear them. So it's actually given me a little empathy for the Guardians and trying to figure out what challenge it is to poke through the moral framework and allow them to access and engage with the things that they care about.
Dawn, could you just say your name and
I'm Dawn Porter. I'm a filmmaker and here with the Sundance Institute group.
That's fantastic. Other thoughts? Yeah.
I just wanted to, commend Orlando on his film. I think it's an incredibly inspirational story, and I previously worked with WWF. My name is Sarah, and has been campaigning on that issue, and now with Marine Stewardship Council. But I think what I reflect on is that, we have foundations that bring such amazing support to realise such powerful stories, but some of the biggest environmental battles are some of the longest and hardest fights. And I think there's always an enormous challenge that once that media spotlight moves off and the celebs move on to their next cause, how do we see it through? And how does this forum matchmake the creatives with the elders, or those who have the political and economic leaders that are needed to deal with big business in the way it needs to be this issue?
Excellent point. Great idea. Other thoughts? One more? I do want to point out some resources that are available to you. One is the Impact Field Guide that BritDoc has published. These are all available online. There is also a Future of Storytelling group that you can Google. Paul Vandenkar has Storytelling and Change as a pamphlet, actually, a book. And then there's a new guide called Spoiler Alert, Culture Shift Strategies. It's called Spoiler Alert. So if you Google any one of those three, there are a tremendous number of resources for you to follow up on. So I think that we will end then at 1 o'clock on time, unexpectedly. And thank you all. Thank the three. Yeah. Sure. I think if we can, as long as we leave by 1:05, because there's another panel coming in. Do you think that's all right? So if people want to stay, does anybody want to scoot out quickly? Otherwise, we'll play the 3 minutes of the Left Behind Children's beautiful footage. It's really great. So we'll play those 3 minutes. But before we go, I just want to thank the panelists and thanks Skoll Foundation for hosting.
买军的袜子都扔了，不往家拿。哎呀！
小点嘞。
你不会，快来家说。我走开了。我这儿走，我不想走。我走的，这你叫了，我走，你别了。来，我背了，来。哎呦，你伤死人家你！哎呦，你伤死人家你！哇，你伤死人家！